The air in Buckingham Palace was heavy, not with tradition, but with the specific, suffocating silence of transition. It was barely 3 days since the full rites of the succession had concluded, and the ghost of the previous reign still clung to the velvet and gilt. King William was not yet seated on the great throne. He was locked away in his private, sparse office, a room where duty was a visible, crushing presence. Protecting this fragile new sovereignty fell to men like Captain Alistair Reed, head of the king's personal guard. Reed was a monolith of discipline, a man whose entire professional existence was built on the unbreachable barrier between the crown and its threats. Yet, Reed was navigating a threat matrix unlike any other in his career. He was guarding the king from emotional implosion, and perhaps from family. His position was a contradiction, an ever-present, silent shadow in the king's innermost sanctum. He stood outside the ornate double doors of the private office, listening to the muffled, tense exchange inside. His focus was total, his senses tuned to detect the single anomaly that would signify a shift from private anguish to physical danger. The threat assessment was clear. Highest probability of internal, non-political violence. The source of that threat was inside the room, the woman who had been queen consort, now simply known by her former title, Camilla. Following the rapid succession, Camilla had entered a new kind of royal purgatory. Stripped of the dignity of her formal status and facing the dismantling of her patronages, she was isolated. Her staff had been politely, ruthlessly disbanded. Her access was restricted. She was no longer queen. She was a political casualty of a streamlined, William-led monarchy, suddenly aware of the financial and social abyss opening beneath her. Her grief over the past was now compounded by a desperate terror of the future. The meeting had been requested by William, a necessary, painful formality. It was intended to be the final, private severing of ties, the moment the new king officially defined her future role, a role that amounted to permanent, quiet retirement from public life. Reed's jaw was tight. He could hear the strained, polite firmness of the king's voice, the cold cadence of official decree. Then he heard the shift. The control in William's tone tightened further, signaling the delivery of the most painful terms. And then, from Camilla, the first sound of breaking, a sharp, choked gasp, followed by a low, desperate sound that was more animalistic than regal. The polite facade had cracked. Captain Reed straightened his spine against the marble wall. His training had prepared him for bombs and bullets, for crowds and snipers. It had not fully prepared him for the moment he knew was coming, the moment duty demanded he intervene in a raw family tragedy. His hand moved subtly toward the discreet holster at his side. He was about to be asked to detain a woman who had, only days earlier, stood beside the king. The line between solemn duty and catastrophic betrayal was about to be erased. Inside the private office, the initial politeness had evaporated, leaving behind the acrid scent of raw family conflict. King William, standing behind his heavy, clean desk, spoke with the cool, measured certainty of a man who had not slept since the funeral, yet whose focus was absolute duty. "The decision, Camilla, is final," William said, his voice flat, a sound colder than the stone walls of the palace. "The review of the royal household budget necessitates extreme austerity. The apartments in Clarence House will be retained for you, of course, but the financial settlement is defined by the terms established in the final agreements. The majority of your staff will be retained in other roles, but your private administrative staff, the 6 aides, will be dissolved by the end of the month." William wasn't just discussing staff, he was discussing control, information, and influence. Dissolving her private team was the surgical removal of her last political infrastructure. He paused, his gaze meeting hers, delivering the final, painful decree. "Furthermore, the patronage's review is complete. All military affiliations will be transferred to working members of the family. Of your 42 charities, we will retain 6 high-profile, low-overhead organizations under your name, purely to manage the transition. The rest must be relinquished immediately. The crown cannot afford the appearance of divided purpose." Camilla, seated rigidly on a Queen Anne chair, had heard the words, but only now registered their full, catastrophic implication. It wasn't about austerity. It was about erasure. William was not offering her a retirement. He was imposing a political exile, stripping her of the very identity she had spent decades building. The final agreements he referenced were legal documents she had signed in good faith, never believing the day would come when they would be ruthlessly enforced. Financial settlement? Camilla whispered, the color draining from her face. William, are you telling me you intend to take away the means to live? To manage the obligations I still have? I spent decades serving, building a life beside your father, and this is my reward? 6 low-profile charities and a caretaker's allowance? William rubbed his temples, the burden of his new role visible in the deep lines around his eyes. You have been fully provided for, Camilla. The arrangement is generous. This is not punitive. It is necessary. The crown must be lean. There can be no ambiguity over who is leading the monarchy's mission. You understand this. He spoke of duty and mission. She heard only betrayal and abandonment. Ambiguity. Camilla surged to her feet, her hands clutching the arms of the chair before pushing it back with a violent scraping sound against the polished floor. Outside the office, Captain Reed's head snapped up. That sound, the sudden, uncontrolled violence against the environment, was the anomaly he was waiting for. His hand rested lightly on the door handle. Inside, Camilla advanced on the king's desk, her voice escalating into a choked, desperate shriek. I understand that you have judged me, that you never truly accepted me. You are doing this because you can, William, because you have the power. Your father would be ashamed of this petty, vindictive cruelty. Her words weren't just attacks. They were emotional detonations aimed at the deepest scars of his childhood. They referenced the public pain, the private trauma, the legacy of a marriage destroyed. William recoiled, not physically, but internally. He looked at her not with anger, but with profound sorrow. That is enough, Camilla, William warned, his voice a low, throbbing thunder. You will not speak of my father in this context, and you will not attribute malice where there is only duty. The restraint in his voice was the final catalyst. Camilla saw only the cold, unyielding wall of the king, the wall that was dismantling her life. She saw decades of struggle to gain acceptance dismissed with a few sterile lines of legal text. Her fear of penury, her consuming grief, and her rage at being discarded merged into a single blinding impulse. Duty! She screamed, her breath ragged. You speak of duty while you steal my life. You are an ungrateful boy. You have always been an ungrateful boy, and you will destroy everything your father built for this throne. She stepped forward, her eyes wild, her face contorted by the complete collapse of her composure. She reached the desk, leaning over it, violating the unspoken personal boundary. The confrontation had officially escalated from a private political disagreement to an uncontrollable emotional and security event. The atmosphere crackled with pure, desperate malice. Outside, Captain Reed made his calculation. The verbal assault was severe, but not yet physical. The integrity of the crown demanded he allow the king to manage the emotional storm if possible. But the shriek of "ungrateful boy" and the sudden advance across the desk had tripped every internal wire. Reed placed his hand on the door handle, knowing the next sound he heard would determine whether he stepped across the ultimate line of duty. He braced himself, a silent, disciplined warrior ready to execute the most agonizing detention order of his life. The final, fatal word "throne" echoed through the thick silence of the private office. It was the word that stripped away decades of protocol, of careful diplomacy, and of the strained attempts at family harmony. It was the moment Camilla, no longer consort or stepmother, became a raw human threat. Captain Reed didn't wait for a direct command. He heard the final, desperate shriek that ended with the word "throne," and his training took over. That single word, the implied accusation of destroying the monarchy for personal gain, was the catalyst. It was a violation of the crown's integrity, and it was followed by the sound of Camilla's hand slamming violently onto the king's desk. The action was immediate, fueled by rage, grief, and panic. She didn't strike the king with her hands. She launched the heavy, crystal-cut paperweight that sat beside William's blotter. It was a priceless, jagged piece of ceremonial glass, designed to replicate the palace's crest. She seized it and threw it with a desperate, wild heave. The projectile was aimed straight at William's head. The king reacted instinctively, raising his arm, turning his face away from the inevitable impact. But before the heavy crystal could connect, the double doors burst open with a sound like a gunshot. Captain Alistair Reed had already crossed the threshold. His movement was not the charging haste of a rescue, but the precise, practiced flow of an unstoppable force. His eyes were not on the weapon, but on the threat source. He registered the trajectory of the crystal only as a blur in his periphery, and he heard the shattering impact against the gilded wall behind the king, the paperweight having missed its mark by mere inches. In that instant, William was safe, but the threat remained active. Reed's presence was terrifyingly calm. He moved in a low, controlled posture, his arm extended not in aggression, but in a formal, mandatory position known as the clear and contain protocol. He did not draw the small sidearm that rested in his holster. His weapon was his training, his discipline, and the sheer weight of his authority. "Your Majesty is clear," Reed announced, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that instantly cut through the remnants of Camilla's shriek. It was a declaration of status, not a question of safety. Camilla, mid-lunge over the desk, spun to face him. She was expecting guards, chaos, and shouting. She found only one man, standing like the embodiment of the palace walls themselves. She screamed at him, a high, strangled sound of pure fury. "Get out! Get out, Captain! This is a family matter. You dare to interrupt the king in his private chamber?" Reed took one slow, deliberate step forward. He did not look at William. His eyes remained locked on Camilla's, cold and completely devoid of judgment or malice. They were the eyes of a mirror reflecting back her own uncontrolled rage. "Ma'am," Reed stated, using the formal address, emphasizing the distance and the dissolution of her queenly title. "By order of the Royal Detention Protocol, Section 3, Subsection Alpha 7, you are immediately considered a physical threat to the crown and are now under protective custody." The phrase, Royal Detention Protocol, was not a palace rumor. It was a rarely used, deeply classified order established for internal crises involving the most senior, non-political members of the family, those who required containment, not arrest. It allowed the guard to act swiftly, formally, and without needing external police intervention, thus preserving absolute secrecy. Camilla stared, disbelief warring with primal fear. "Protective custody? You are arresting me? For what? For defending my family's dignity?" King William, his chest heaving, slowly lowered his raised arm. He looked at the shattered crystal on the wall, then at the man who had just saved him from a likely concussion. He met Reed's eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, the silent, agonizing ratification of the detention order. Reed accepted the order and began the final, formal act. He stepped around the desk, deliberately avoiding any hurried movement. He closed the distance to Camilla, maintaining a professional 2-foot space. He did not grab her, nor did he use force. He used a voice designed to project absolute, immutable control. "Ma'am, I require you to lower your hands. This is not an arrest by civil authority. This is a containment under royal authority. We must proceed immediately to a secure, designated residence outside the palace grounds." He reached into his inner pocket and produced a thin, leather document, the official Royal Detention Order, pre-signed by the Lord Chamberlain for use only in this type of extremity. He held it up for her to see, the seal of the crown starkly visible. The formality of the document, the legal weight of the crown's immense power, finally broke through her hysteria. She saw the trap closing, sealed not by William's personal anger, but by the cold, impersonal architecture of the state she had served. "No, no, William. You can't do this," Camilla pleaded, turning to the king, reaching out a desperate hand to him. William shook his head slowly, his voice laced with exhaustion and sorrow. "You forced my hand, Camilla. I offered you peace. You chose war. The stability of the crown is paramount. Captain Reed's duty is clear." As William spoke, Reed executed the final step. He subtly positioned himself between Camilla and the exit. He then placed one hand, gloved, formal, and utterly detached, lightly on her elbow. Not to guide, but to mark possession. It was the least physical detention possible, yet the most humiliating. "We are departing now, ma'am," Reed instructed, his voice firm but low enough that it would not carry past the thick walls. "We will walk slowly. Any attempt to resist, scream, or create a disturbance will require the immediate application of restraint, which is an event I strongly wish to avoid. Your cooperation now will ensure your privacy later." Camilla stood motionless for a moment, the weight of the captain's hand on her arm feeling like the weight of the entire monarchy pressing down. Her fight, driven by sudden adrenaline and rage, collapsed into shuddering defeat. She realized her screams would be instantly suppressed. Her resistance would be met by professional, overwhelming force, and the scandal would be contained before the outside world knew anything had happened. With a final, broken whimper, she nodded once. Captain Reed led her out, his posture rigid, his face an emotionless mask. He ushered the woman who had been queen through the back corridors of Buckingham Palace, a silent, escorted exile. William remained in the office, staring at the glittering fragments of the shattered crystal on the wall, the perfect symbol of the fragile, painful, and often brutal nature of his new crown. The exit was swift, silent, and brutal in its formality. Captain Reed, maintaining the iron grip of the royal detention protocol, escorted the detained woman not through the ceremonial halls, but through a maze of service passages used only by staff and maintenance. Camilla was taken directly to a secure diplomatic vehicle waiting in a secluded courtyard, surrounded by a detachment of unmarked, non-uniformed officers. She was transported immediately to the designated residence, a remote, highly secured private manor in the countryside, historically reserved for senior family members requiring enforced, discreet convalescence. No hospital, no prison, just immediate, absolute isolation managed entirely by the crown. Reed ensured the secure transfer, then returned to the palace to execute the second, crucial phase of the protocol, containment and secrecy. King William remained in the office for nearly 20 minutes, motionless. The silence that followed Camilla's departure was not peace. It was the echoing void of a shattered relationship. He looked at the shattered crystal on the gilded wall, the physical proof of the knight's extremity, and then at the slight red welt on his forearm where the paperweight had grazed him. He was king, but he was also a man who had just exiled the woman who married his father. He finally moved, picking up the heavy phone designated for the private secretary. His voice was level, almost impossibly calm. "The situation has been stabilized. Queen Consort Camilla has immediately, been moved to a private, secure residence for necessary rest. The official statement will cite long-standing fatigue and the emotional toll of the succession. Access is strictly restricted to designated medical personnel and myself. All of her former staff are to be immediately reassigned. No leaks, no speculation. This matter ends here." This was the payoff. Not a triumphant victory, but the surgical preservation of the crown's stability. The narrative was controlled, the political risk was neutralized, and the internal chaos was rendered invisible to the world. The greatest threat to the new reign, Camilla's unpredictable grief and rage, had been contained by a signature on a pre-prepared order and the flawless execution of duty. Later that evening, after the last of the day's formal appointments, Captain Reed returned to the private office. The shattered crystal had been removed, the wall repaired with speed and precision, and the desk wiped clean. It was as if the incident had never occurred. Reed stood before the king, offering his formal, final report. "Your Majesty." Protocol was followed. The subject is contained, secure, and fully isolated. No external staff were utilized. No records have been logged in the official security ledger. The risk is mitigated. William raised his head, looking not at the captain, but at the man who had executed the impossible duty. "Alistair," William said, his voice quiet, "you acted alone, on your own initiative, based only on sound assessment. You saved me from an injury, but more importantly, you saved the monarchy from a catastrophe that would have ended her career and mine publicly." Reed held his salute. "I executed my duty to the crown, Your Majesty. My actions were within the parameters of the established, if rarely invoked, protocol." William shook his head. "A lesser man would have hesitated. He would have called for backup, raising an alarm, bringing witnesses. You stepped in and solved a political and emotional crisis with a physical intervention that felt like an act of formal compassion. You had to physically subdue a woman who, only a week ago, was wearing the crown. I am certain that was a burden. Reed lowered his hand. He allowed a flicker of the toll to cross his face, a brief, profound weariness. It was the hardest decision of my career, Your Majesty. But my duty is to your safety, and to the seamless transition of the crown. She had become a threat to both. The two men shared a silent understanding. The burden of the crown was not the weight of the gold, but the crushing weight of the decisions required to protect it. Reed had done what William could not. He had acted with detached, formal cruelty to save the institution. The emotional toll was immense. For William, the cost was the final, irreversible loss of any notion of family comfort within the palace walls. He had proven his fitness to rule by sacrificing personal feeling to national stability. For Captain Reed, the cost was the knowledge that his absolute loyalty could require him to violate every instinct of personal respect, forcing him to detain a woman in the manner usually reserved for enemies of the state. The next morning, the papers ran flawless, respectful stories about the king's strong start and Queen Camilla's sudden, quiet retreat to recover from exhaustion. The world saw a seamless transition of power, a monarchy strong and united. They never saw the shattered crystal, the anguished face of the exiled woman, or the burden carried by the captain, who had traded his conscience for the crown's security. The peace was purchased with the destruction of a life, proving that the king's guard did not just protect the man, but mercilessly preserved the machine.